You have got to be kidding me. What the hell do you mean he's not coming back? We're in this mess because of his bloody actions, and when things start going bad he just decides to not come home and deal with them? I'm afraid so, though I do understand Lord Governor's reluctance to return. By now, his expedition is in the center of the archipelago, and apparently that creature that guides them claims they're close to reaching their objective. And while continuing the expedition may not seem like a priority, if Lord Erigen can uncover secrets of the Pillared City, especially their seeming ability to reverse death itself, then it may prove extremely beneficial to the war effort. Besides, thanks to your machines, Arius should be able to coordinate both with us and with both Admiral Yarohin and General Vestrand, and in fact he already sent them their orders, even though he had to use several drones placed along the way, since the distance is too far to just use a single one. Regardless, while I was waiting for you, I managed to contact both of our commanders to confirm our plan. They should be good to begin operations within a day or two. And what exactly are they supposed to do? For Admiral Yarohin, he is to use his fleet to secure our domination on the seas, which may not be an easy task, since the rumors about Frostlings working with emerald colonies turn out to be true, and he already reported several dozen longboats around the Ninevian floating city. Still, the Cold Ones may actually turn out to be beneficial for us, as people here will eagerly rally to fight and destroy them once and for all. And as for General Vestrand, he is to gather his troops, while keeping a garrison in Lark Fen, which is our most vulnerable settlement right now, and sail south to attack emerald colonies and, if possible, capture one of their settlements to act as a forward base of operations. Wait, aren't we on the defensive here? Shouldn't we prepare our southern cities for attack from the elves? I thought so at first, but Brimir argued against it. From what Arius have told us, it seems that this whole declaration of war came completely out of nowhere, probably forced upon Miss Servinhard by her father. With that in mind, we can assume that their forces in the archipelago are not organized well, or maybe even are completely unprepared for this conflict. So, General Vestrand decided to not give our enemies even a single moment to consolidate their forces. We should seize the initiative, push south as quickly as possible, and force emerald colonies to fight in their own territory, as this will not only dismantle any offensive plans they may have, but also keep our own territory safe. As our dwarven friend said, it is always better to fight in enemy land. That way your own will not end up devastated by marching armies. I see. It makes sense, but wouldn't it leave some of our own frontier open to attack coming from another direction? That is always a risk, yes, but it is also exactly where Lord Governor's expedition comes in. He may not be around, but the force he took on that trip is significant. All we have to do is to present it in such a way as to make our enemies believe that Arius is not actually moving away, but towards them, and not on his own, but with his most elite troops and retainers. And a threat of such force suddenly attacking emerald colonies from behind should keep Raylis guessing. It makes sense, but I doubt it will work for very long. Unless some kind of attack comes from that direction, she will realize we're just bluffing. True, which is why Lord Governor decided to reduce the size of his expedition. The automatons will be sent back to Haddock, since it's as vulnerable as Lark Fen. Knights of the Trident will sail back towards the front lines, where their presence is bound to turn some fight in our favor. But the important part will be the light fleet. As we speak, it should be sailing south, deeper into emerald-controlled waters. There, it should be able to cause enough of a distraction to keep at least some of their forces occupied, which is all that General Vestrand needs to launch his offensive. You are dreadfully good at this, you know, but nonetheless I'm happy you're helping out. I would have no idea what to do in a situation like that. Hell, even now after you told me the plan, I'm still unsure what I myself can do to help. Simply do what you're good at, design new things and improve old ones. Speaking of, how goes the work on your latest project? We already have a prototype of the machine tested. We just need to make a few minor adjustments to its build and improve handling, and it should be good to mass produce in a month. But it's not really as spectacular as cannons or tanks, and it certainly can't compete with them in terms of firepower. True, but it can move fast and provide our forces with one of the most important things in any war: information. If General Vestrand knows where the enemy are and where they are not, he can prepare his own forces accordingly. Anyway, I'll talk to the craftsmen in the city and make sure we can build them as quickly as we can as soon as they're ready. But now, can you tell me something about the other project? I admit, I'm quite curious if my suggestion proved useful. It did. I was so focused on trying to make these communication devices working both ways that the idea of making one that could simply receive voice from other ones completely slipped my mind. And as you said, they are a lot cheaper and easier to make. In fact, we already have about 100 of them ready to go. Good. Send them to our warehouse in the docks and I will see to it that every settlement receives at least one. This is going to be a perfect tool to rally our people to this war, and perhaps soon enough we will be able to address every single citizen in their homes. The possibilities are endless. Allowing government to speak and be heard by citizens across the entire colony is just a small thing. Education, trade, war, everything can benefit from these machines. You should be proud of yourself, Arcadian. You may not be a politician, but you still contribute more to Mutsakka than any other person, myself and Lord Erigen included. Perhaps, but I still think you should be actual civilian governor. I'm just getting in your way and waste time I could spend in my workshop. Oh, but I am governor, in anything but name. Titles don't really matter as much as power behind them, something that Arius clearly understands. If you say so. I'll have to say though, I'm surprised just how loyal you are to him, considering that he removed you from your position. And placed me in it right back, but with a different name written on my door. Besides, I am also grateful to Lord Erigen for his reforms. Never before House Gerstein was so influential. But there is more to it. The three of us, you, Arius and myself, share one common thing. We have nowhere else to go. Arius and I would probably end up dead if we ever sailed back to the continent, and you would be arrested by your former guild members for sharing their secrets. True, but why would anyone want to kill you? Because my family actually came from Emerald Council. We were chased away by the High King, Raelis' father, after my father dared to disagree with him on some financial policy. We never owned much, but what we had was seized. My father was arrested for treason, and my mother and I fled to Southern, where she used what little connections she had to restore some of our influence. It's a long story, but it ends with Ishizawa outmaneuvering me and sending me here as a form of political exile. And so, Mutsakka is my home now, the only place where I can tell I'm safe. And so, I'm going to do everything I can to keep it that way, no matter how many of my former countrymen I'll have to fight to achieve it. A new day dawned on Metzaca, but while the rising sun was usually welcomed with a din of workshops and factories, on this morning it was welcomed by silence. Everyone, from lowest workers to highest members of the government, had only one thing on their minds: war. On that first day when it was proclaimed to the public, the announcement sounded unreal. Yes, Indecisive Archipelago was a tumultuous and dangerous place, and news of various fights reached citizens pretty much every week, but this was something different. Not a hunt against some monsters, nor an expedition against some independent settlement or a commune of brigands. This was the big one, an actual war declared by regional power, backed additionally by one of the most powerful continental nations. But as Metzakans would soon learn, Emerald colonies needed no support from home, as they were able to locally muster a lot more forces than their foes anticipated. For that first day, though, things remained quiet and surreal for both sides, as people on either side of the front slowly processed information that their yesterday's associates, friends and trade partners were now their sworn enemies. In Mutsakka, the embassy of Emerald Colonies was surrounded by local forces and, within the next 24 hours, its staff, wielding documents that proclaimed their diplomatic immunity high in the air for everyone to see, was escorted out to the docks and sent south on a chartered private ship, while their former office was now thoroughly investigated by Metzacan government. The same, of course, happened in Elven capital. The diplomats would return from there unharmed as well, but such a move sent a clear message. The time for diplomacy was over, and now it would be the military doing the talking, to the clang of swords and din of firearms. Soon, that first bizarre day passed, and as citizens of colonial cities gathered in the streets next morning to listen to public announcement issued from a series of new model machines, they understood that yesterday was indeed real, and that war was here to stay. Said announcements began with a standard fare, proclaims of swift victory and denouncements of both Emerald Colonies and Emerald Council itself, followed by encouragement to everyone to either join the army or to simply work as hard as possible to provide the nation with coin and supplies it would certainly need to defeat such a well-established enemy. Then, however, came first reports from the front, something that people of Mutsakka would soon grow accustomed to, as, thanks to their advanced technology, frontline troops could easily transfer information back to the city, where it was then properly trimmed to fit the official message of the government and released to the public in daily statements. These first reports, however, were mostly unfiltered ones, brought by a heavy fleet of Admiral Yarohin, stationed in floating city of the Ninevians. According to said news, several Frostling warbands were spotted around the area, some moving on land but with most of them already packed onto their longboats. The Cold Ones were not alone, however. Some of the elven warriors and mages were spotted moving with these warbands as well, together with some magical support like elementals, and even some of the more primitive beings that inhabited these islands like trolls and ogres, no doubt broken into submission beforehand by Lady Servinhart's forces. Individually, these warbands were numerous but not overwhelmingly threatening, and so Admiral Yarohin decided to seize the initiative, and instead of waiting for his foes to come to him, he set sail from the floating city and rushed north, towards the area where most of the longboats were spotted moving along the shore. This, of course, meant that Nevian City would be left undefended, but the locals proved to be more than willing to help, or at the very least it seemed that way. With linguistic barriers still being almost impossible to overcome, Admiral Yarohin used the few words he knew to ask the locals to organize themselves and defend their settlement, while his people would move away. The Ninevians responded as they usually did. They simply nodded in unison all at once, without uttering a single sound, and immediately rushed to work, forming up their watery population into something resembling a militia, equipped with watery swords, bows, and even riding aquatic horses, all of which completely baffled the few scholars who were here. Said scholars, however, would not remain there for long. This place was, after all, the most exposed bit of Metzacan territory, and so all but the bravest and insane researchers simply left as soon as news of the war reached them. Fortunately for these scholars, Metzacan heavy fleet would ensure their safe passage, for after 2 days of sailing, they spotted first group of Frostling longboats and, after an hour-long maneuvers to secure the wind gauge, rushed in to intercept them. And it was on that day when reports from the front turned from grim into extremely optimistic, because heavy fleet simply obliterated its opposition. The Frostlings were good sailors, and their longboats were certainly quite maneuverable and fast in right circumstances, but they still relied on old-style tactics of simply rushing at the enemy and boarding enemy ships while wizards provided fire support. It was a devastatingly good tactic to use against merchant ships and lightly armed vessels, but against hulking capital ships of Mutsakka, it was immediately countered by tremendous firepower colonials could bring to bear, for no matter how strong a crew of longboat was, once their ship was sunk, the warriors would either go down with it or be sitting ducks in range of Metzacan deck gunners. In those first engagements, both fleets simply rushed at each other, but as soon as they were in range, Frosting longboats found themselves under a devastating hailstorm of cannon rounds and ballista bolts. With galleons and elven stormbreaker ships providing more pinpoint base of fire, massive man-o'-wars from dockyards of Mutsakka sailed right into the middle of hostile formation and unloaded a fiery barrage in all directions from their short-barreled coronet cannons, breaking hulls and cleaning decks of any warriors too brave or too foolish to take cover. The Cold Ones launched their own attack in response, but with their icy mages already being decimated and literally shattered to pieces, such a counterattack barely had any effect. A handful of the longboats reached one of the colonial ships and boarded it, but by then warriors simply suffered too heavy losses, and while they did a number on the crew of that ship, they were eventually wiped out to the last. The first victory of the war went to Metzacans, but Admiral Yarohin knew his work was far from over. As was said, his foes were more numerous than his force, and so he would not waste time. He had to move into another engagement as quickly as possible to thin enemy numbers to ensure safety of this most exposed Metzacan outpost. But more than that, by keeping Emerald forces occupied, even though so far only a handful of actual elves were spotted, Heavy Fleet could buy General Grimir Vestrand enough time to organize his own forces and sail south to bring the fight directly into Emerald Heartlands. Some people back home, however, still had one rather pertinent question. What was happening with Lord Governor Arius Erigen? He was, after all, military leader of the colonies, and while his second-in-command General Vestrand was certainly just as skilled in military matters, if not more, Arius's reputation of an adventurer meant that everyone expected him to be on the front lines as well. This, however, couldn't be further from truth, for even though Lord Arius knew about the conflict, he decided that his expedition deeper into the archipelago was a lot more important, and decided to continue it. Of course, it did not mean he would not contribute anything for the war effort. For one, he would coordinate the strategy with his ministers and officers by using Arcadian's drones, and secondly, he would send a significant part of his expedition back. A number of automatons were detached from the force and sent to Haddock, for, as newest addition to Metzacan territory, it was the least defended city out there, and one of the most exposed, as Metzacans would soon learn. The Knights of the Trident would go back as well, in order to link up with General Vestrand's army, where their presence was bound to raise morale and provide a tremendously reliable shock company that could single-handedly turn tides of any battle. For, after so many years of fighting side by side with Arius, said knights, despite being technically outdated, could stand up to anything the world could throw at them and emerge victorious. And finally, escorting Light Fleet would be sent back into the fray as well, but unlike knights and automatons, it would not go in an obvious direction. Instead, the prince ordered commander of the Light Fleet to sail south, which would place this force deep behind enemy lines and simply cause as much distraction and chaos as possible there. At the same time, that fleet was to act as if the prince was with it as well, in hopes that it would distract Emerald armies enough to divide their forces. But the prince himself, however, together with his retainers, tanks, scouts and elementals, would keep sailing west, keeping in touch with the main force and providing his advice, while continuing the charade of pretending he was active behind enemy lines. But as the expedition sailed deeper into the archipelago, contact, even using drones, became increasingly difficult, and soon Arius barely had time to exchange few sentences with his officers before his drones were out of range. This, for now at least, was to be a war fought without the man most responsible for it. But while this war was a grim affair, where people who often knew each other would be forced to fight, it also provided the colony with new opportunities and new friends. It was no secret that, for the past decade or so, Goblin Republics and Emerald Council were at each other's throats, looking for but a single pretext to go to war. The elves, realizing that goblin industrialization already turned them into most powerful power on the old continent, one capable of standing up even to the Northern Empire, wished for nothing more but to cut the goblins down to size, before they could overwhelm everything with superior numbers and mass-produced weapons and trade goods. The Republics, on the other hand, aware of tremendous speed of their growth, wanted to remove their only true rival they had on the continent, and at the same time seize some of Elven rich and fertile territories to feed their increasingly growing population. Tensions back home were higher than ever, and everyday people looked to newspapers afraid of inevitable conflict. For now though, fragile peace was still in place, but everyone knew that a continent-wide war was only a matter of time. And so, following the ancient saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, mere days after war between Emerald Council and colonies of Mutsakka was declared, representatives of Goblin republics and their own colonial interests approached Governor Arcadian and Minister Gerstein with an offer of closer cooperation. It was not a military alliance, of course, for that would certainly be the last straw that would push continental powers to war, but so far various economic and diplomatic treaties were signed, with both sides promising to, quote, ensure safety, prosperity and peace of the archipelago. Several talks were made between Gerstein and Senator Gorzo Plogvisher, former professor of Griscom University, recently elected to act as a governor of Republican colonial area, and certain hushed promises were made to make sure that emeralds would not become too influential in the archipelago, especially since its mystical nature proved to be a lot more profitable than anyone expected a few decades ago. And yet, some issues arose as well. As it turned out, cooperation with Crimson Company was something that Senator Plogvisher did not exactly approve, but at this point everyone decided to simply keep their hatchet buried until the conflict with Lady Servinhart was resolved. Soon, a new proclamation was made in Metzacan streets, one that lifted spirits of many who heard it. The nation was not standing alone for the first time since its creation. But as soldiers marching south under the Trident learned, Lady Servinhart was not alone either. The Frostlings were of course their most obvious new allies, or to be honest their main force, at least for now, as it seemed that Lady Marshall was unwilling to send her own people into battle just yet. But Cold Ones were just a start, and as light fleets sailed south and reached internal waters of Emerald colonies, they learned that their foes were just as busy making allies in these islands as Metzacans were. When frigates and caravels of light fleets started rampaging across the sea in the south, hunting merchants and lone patrol ships, they quickly realized that elves themselves were not heavily present here either. Instead, the sea was full of small junks manned predominantly by goblin merchants and fishermen. But more interesting was a large presence of halflings, whose bulky cargo vessels lazily sailed in all directions, filled to the brim with goods that could only be described as interesting. It was no surprise that many of continental halfling criminal families fled to the archipelago to escape the law and to expand their markets, but to see them sailing openly under emerald banners was a surprise for everyone, at least until sailors from Light Fleet captured one of the halfling ships and found out that its cargo was, to say it in diplomatic terms, probably unsafe for civilized society. The vessel was filled from top to bottom with alcohol and drugs, some of which so potent that the mere smell of them made sailors twitchy. The rum made from local sugar beets was so strong that you could barely feel anything after first sip, and the weird blue powder stored in small wooden boxes was enough to render an entire, moderately sized town unconscious, and that was just a single ship. But as much as presence of halfling cartels was a surprise, Emerald forces had another one in store, and this one was far more problematic. For while colonial fleets were busy in the south, a small task force of elven warships somehow slipped past them and sailed all the way to the now empty Merfolk settlement, where they used element of surprise to completely overrun 3 of Metzacan naval bases, and in mere days were already on their way towards another one, before anyone could even realize what was going on. What's worse, by losing these bases, Mutsakka lost not only a lot of good people who defended them, but also a safe trade route to company territory, as well as several extraction sites. A handful of civilians managed to reach Ermendal and Sidiu in the coming days, where they were immediately intercepted by government agents and instructed to not spread panic, but from these refugees Metzacans learned about the another issue. Apparently, this elven strike force wasn't really elven as well. They only had one ship there, but the vast majority of that group was composed out of krakens, ones mercifully much smaller than the ones colonial forces had to face during their battle against Sea Dwellers. It was impossible to say how Raelus's forces managed to tame these creatures. But the implication was clear. Emerald colonies were not as helpless on the sea as Metzakans were led to believe, and with this highly mobile force, that for the most part could simply hide underwater, they could attack them in any place at any time. Most of the ports were safe, of course, but the shipping lanes were not, and even though merchants were redirected towards a longer northern route, they could also be attacked there, and that was unacceptable. This single small group of enemies could wreak havoc behind colonial lines and cause serious dent in Metzacan finances, and by extension the war effort itself. And so, shipyards of Ermendal and Surcaris set off to work again to build some new vessels as quickly as possible, or to just repurpose some of merchant ships with additional cannons and hand down these raiders no matter what. And in a way, their mission was successful, as they managed to retake lost naval bases with no casualties in the following months, but by then Emerald Strike Force simply vanished into thin air and could be anywhere. The new Northern Fleet had its job cut out for it, and as they would learn in the coming months, it would not be an easy one. But that wasn't the only surprise that Mutsakka had to deal with in the coming days, though fortunately the other one proved to be a lot less dangerous, at least at a glance. As weeks and months went on, Yarahin's heavy fleet continued its operation in the area between Ninevian Settlement, Laokfen and Dawsmere, where they scored victory after victory against numerous but disorganized and disjointed Frostling raiders. Using these naval actions as cover, General Vestrand consolidated and reorganized his force, focusing on leaving a decent garrison in exposed Laokfen, and sailed south as well, with intent to assault and conquer settlement of the Cold Ones to stop the threat they posed once and for all, and to seize initiative and move the war into enemy territory. As he and his soldiers sailed south, however, they all suddenly found themselves flooded by a massive number of drones, once bearing markings of Republic of Southern, their former homeland. But these drones were not here to fight, and instead simply dropped dozens of letters on top of the fleet, and then continued on to do the same to every Metzacan and Emerald settlement they could find. As it turned out, these messages, or message, just copied thousands of times, were sent by Governor-General Caval Hegren of Southern Colonies, and were addressed to people on both sides of the front, and to Arius and Raylis directly. And in them, Old Man Caval denounced this, as he called it, senseless conflict and implored everyone, soldiers and civilians, to lay down their arms and don't engage in such war. As expected though, the message had very little effect. Some people were indeed not happy with the war, but especially right now, when Metzacan forces were on a roll and scored victory after victory, such pacifism could not sway enough people to make even a tiniest dent in the war effort. Especially since both soldiers and civilians were about to witness yet another shiny new tool of war designed by Governor Arcadian and his students, a tool that would move the conflict from the land and sea all the way into the sky.
Good morning to all of you listening out there, and welcome to our daily report, The Voice of Mutsakka, where we give you all the latest information on the situation from across the nation. As with our previous reports, we begin this one with news from the front, and let me tell you, the news is just as good as it can be. Our forces, both land and naval ones, are marching south relentlessly, pushing back Emerald colonies and their Frostling cronies every day, and at this point it is expected that the complete victory against our treacherous adversaries will be achieved before the next holiday season. For even though our foes certainly possess forces that could outnumber our own, they were so far unable to consolidate them into any truly threatening force, which allowed our heavy fleet under Admiral Yarahin to wipe out dozens of Frostling raiding parties, securing our own shores in the process. A number of prisoners have been captured as well, and are currently being transported to a holding camp just outside of Dawsmere, where their fate will be decided during a lawful trial. Some voices have claimed that Frostings as a threat to our people do not deserve such leniency and should instead simply be executed. But Governor Arcadian and Minister Gerstein decided, after long-distance debates with Lord Erigen and the rest of the council, that times have indeed changed, and people who we once thought of only as enemies may deserve a second chance. Though it is rather obvious that such a chance will not be given to them easily, and certainly not during this conflict. So, what will Frostings do with our generous offer? That remains to be seen. Speaking of, said conflict is actually the reason why Metzacan government decided to further investigate our relations with Cold Ones. For, as our troops noticed, they form the vast majority of Emerald forces sent against us. Almost as if the treacherous Lady Sevenheart was too afraid to face our might directly. Or perhaps she understands the severity of her situation. For as General Vestrand and Admiral Yauhin lead the bulk of our military to the south, we receive daily reports from Lord Governor's Special Task Force, which, together with the Light Fleet, is currently operating far to the southwest, deep inside enemy territory. As we speak, Lord Arius and his most elite retainers and soldiers are striking our foes from inside their own territory, cutting supply lines and overwhelming any reinforcement Emerald armies may try to muster. And it is their heroic efforts that no doubt keep Sevenheart forces occupied, running around like headless chickens looking for Lord Arius, who is able to outsmart and outmaneuver them at every step. But from those same forces that operate deep inside enemy territory, we have also learned about other vile acts committed by our foes. As Lord Governor and the Light Fleet move south, they uncover more and more evidence that Emerald colonies wish for nothing but to conquer this entire place and enslave everyone living here. A number of goblin settlements were already spotted, all adorned with banners of House Servanheart, and all clearly showing signs of damage as if they were conquered recently. Even more, it would appear that Emerald colonies also cooperate with one or more of the Halfling cartels, who made their home in this archipelago after fleeing from law enforcement on the old continent. As such, we must assume that our enemies will stop at nothing in order to conquer and enslave us all, and so we must all work side by side together to ensure that our glorious, newly born nation will not just become a footnote in history, and that our hard-won freedom and prosperity won't be stolen by continental regimes. Moving on, with news of the war out of the way, it's time for more domestic information. First and foremost, we have some great news for everyone who follow these daily reports. Right now, in order to listen to us, most people have to gather on town squares or local government offices, but that is going to change soon. We spoke to Governor Arcadian earlier today, and he said that within the next few months, cheap and affordable voice receivers should enter mass production, which will allow all of you, dear listeners, to hear the voice of Mutsakka within your very own homes. With that in mind, we are currently planning to increase the amount of information we can provide you, and also offer you a bit of entertainment in these challenging times. As we speak, negotiations are underway with Madame Seflin, renowned as the best singer in Lark Fen, to grace some of these messages we sent to you with her angelic voice. And believe me, once you hear her you will be spellbound forever. And that is but a small taste of what's to come. For, using the same technology, our government have also begun a project to link us properly with the continent itself. Using a network of drones, boats and automatons, the Ministry of Infrastructure is currently building a line that will allow us to send messages back to the continent, and receive them back, at unprecedented speeds. No longer will you have to wait months for a postal ship to arrive, nor weeks for messenger birds to fly in. No longer will you have to pay outlandish sums of gold to sorcerers to send a message across the ocean. With this magnificent project, we will be able to receive and send information across the waves in matter of several hours, something that will no doubt especially help merchants who, until now, were highly vulnerable to market fluctuations. Still, such a tremendous endeavour requires not only money, but a lot of work to be done. So if any of you listeners out there wish to help Mutsakka prosper, report to your nearest branch of either Ministry of Infrastructure or Ministry of Colonization, if you are away from major cities, where our officials will tell you how you could help. But we must now take a small break from our regular news to address citizens of Dolesmere specifically. If you are outside, then right about now you may start to hear a buzzing noise from above. Do not be alarmed. In fact, you can and you should raise your eyes towards the sky and wave towards our brave new breed of soldiers, pilots of our gyrocopters. These flying machines are currently passing above Dolsmere on their way to the front, where they will no doubt prove once and for all that our wisdom and technology are second to none, and that our foes should think twice before challenging us, for we can now dominate the skies themselves. Armed with bombs, mounted guns, and powered by truly astonishingly advanced mana cells, these machines can soar above any enemy formation and strike them wherever and whenever they want. It does not matter what Emerald colonies can bring to the field, for our pilots will simply be above it, able to pick their fights and fly circles above our hapless enemies without any risk to themselves. And if everything went according to plan, then they should be passing above Central Square of Dolsmere exactly right now. So raise your eyes everyone and salute our brave boys and girls who will fight in the skies in our name. And for those who are not in Dolsmere, a reminder that these machines, the Credence model, will soon enter mass production across the entire colony. So if you currently find yourself without occupation and wish to contribute to the war effort, as every citizen should, then know our aviation factories will soon have plenty of work for everyone. We will use everything we can to preserve our nation, no matter what it takes. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Voice of Mutsakka. We will hear each other again tomorrow. And now, the weather.
The sight of colonial gyrocopters proved to be exactly what people of Metzacan needed to completely push them into warlike mind. It was a little wonder, for these machines, despite the obvious military applications, also had another effect. They stroked egos of those who witnessed them. A number of them were deployed to pretty much every single major settlement, and now made regular appearances in the skies above them, reassuring population of their nation's might. Look at them, people said, staring at these floating machines. Few years back we were holed up in the single city, waving crossbows and outdated matchlocks in fear at bandits outside our walls. And look at us now, masters of these lands, seas, and now the sky. Of course, such talks would no doubt be different if Mutsakka suffered some defeats, but until now every single engagement ended in colonial victory, and General Hegren's message of peace simply disappeared, washed away by a wave of patriotic fervor. And on that wave, General Vestron and his force landed just a few dozen kilometers away from the city of Frostling refugees, and began marching towards it with raised heads and morale as high as never before. Though, it has to be said, Brimir himself wasn't exactly pleased, for his skills were mostly on using cavalry to conduct swift and unexpected attacks, something that siege assaults were pretty much a polar opposite of. Still, though he grumbled in safety of his own tent, when he was seen by his men he was always completely single-minded and focused on the objective. He would send his cavalry deeper into the island to cause mayhem and distract any enemy reinforcements, while he would take his infantry and machines and take the Frostlings down once and for all. Though, as some people noticed, Frozen Ones were already taken out once and for all twice, and yet they were still very much around. But as was said, morale was high, so everyone jokingly said that 3 times the charm, and that this siege will finally put the frozen menace into the ground for good. And, as it happened, the chance to do so appeared much sooner than anyone expected, something that General Brimir, unaccustomed to sieges, was very grateful for. For as his army approached the city, the troops all realized that this battle would not be a walk in the park. The fortress they were about to storm was similar in size to Mutsakka and nestled safely at the end of the valley, which meant that it could only be approached from one side, and that side was additionally protected by an imposing stone wall with bastions that would funnel attackers into kill zones as they tried to storm the gates. What's more, frostling magic was present as well, and the air was extremely chilly, with water constantly freezing and thawing depending on the amount of sunlight. And then, finally, there were the defenders. Entire wall was covered with banners and soldiers, waiting for Metzacans to approach. seeing that even General Vestrand, who was not happy about the idea of prolonged siege, decided to take a step back, and instead of sending his men to attack right away, he ordered them to surround the city and start making holes in its defenses using cannons. It meant, of course, that the battle would not be decided right away, something that could give the rest of Emerald Colony's chance to organize counterattack, but it was still better than assault on such well-defended position. But in the end, the siege did not happen. For mere moments after Metzacan soldiers received orders to start digging trenches and prepare artillery positions, the gates were suddenly thrown open, and, to sound of dozens of blaring horns, the Frostling army poured out of their fortifications with a deafening war cry. Figures made out of ice, the oldest and most venerable of the Cold Ones, rushed alongside their younger brothers and sisters, their weapons held high, moving as fast as their rigid bodies allowed them to close the distance between both armies. From the walls, a company of goblins launched an improvised bomb filled with things so filthy that no one should even dare to try and describe them, and struck some of the engineers who failed to fall back quickly enough, killing some of them on the spot and completely demoralizing the rest with sheer sensory overload of this attack. Corpse meat, unknown chemicals and other indescribable filth clinged to engineers who, thanking the stars for their face masks, dropped everything, including their wounded, and rushed back to the main line, with crews of tanks and cannons and the dryads from Lark Fen running sideways to get out of their way. The situation was obvious to everyone. Just as Metzacans were not willing to engage in a prolonged siege, the Frostlings were not willing to just sit behind their walls and take the bombardment while waiting to starve to death. Instead, they gathered everyone they could muster, and even armed every willing civilian, and charged out, hoping to either break away and flee south, or force their enemies to retreat. The army under banners of House Erigen, however, while taken by surprise, was more than willing to oblige. The Cold Ones were a dangerous foe, that was certain, but right now they were all trying to run outside of the city through 3 gates, which meant it would take them a while to gather all of their forces, and that time could be used to turn those already outside into icy dust, with their enemies right in front of them, clearly visible against the wall behind their backs. Colonial gunners had their pick of targets, and mere moments after first gateway was thrown open, they took aim and sent a thundering barrage towards their foes, toppling entire rows of frozen warriors, killing and shattering them as they ran. Engineers rushed towards the guns to help reload and aim them again, although that one group struck by goblins caused more harm than good, simply by spreading nausea among the rest of the troops, while tanks rolled forward to prevent anyone from getting too close. Seeing that, General Vestrand could not help but to smile. His foes, cold-blooded and made out of ice, have never seen these weapons in actions, and they were in for a nasty surprise. For now though, the Frostlings had no idea. They simply charged on with their mages, archers and harpoon throwers already launching first attacks, some of which struck home and took down some of the gun crews. But then, as they got closer, colonial tanks rumbled into action once again, and when hundreds of foes were right in front of them, they unleashed their deadly weapons. The war cry of the Cold Ones immediately turned into horrified, inhuman scream as dozens upon dozens of warriors fell to the ground covered in flames, rolling around desperately to douse the inferno. Some of the older ones, made almost entirely out of ice, simply melted away within seconds, their screams dying out as their bodies turned to water and steam. Across the whole line, entire companies of warriors were simply evaporated into nothingness, with only their banners floating above the firestorm. It all took less than a minute, but by the time Metzacan tanks turned their flamethrowers off, almost entire first wave of Frostling attack was gone, with only a handful of survivors who managed to douse the flames by rolling in puddles of water that mere months ago were their fellow warriors. But these survivors would not remain alive for long. For mere moments after the inferno ended, automatons of Steel Legion of Surcaris stomped forward and drowned everyone who was still alive in a hailstorm of massive, man-sized arrows. Even engineers who operated the cannons were sent forward to deal with last remaining groups, so that the army could prepare for another wave. But while one side of enemy assault was wiped out, forces in the center fared a bit better, though only barely, as they had more mages in their ranks, who managed to raise barriers before being struck by flames, and even then that wasn't enough. But as the flames cleared there, Cold Ones suddenly realized that now they were being charged by a ragtag company of men and women wielding two-handed axes and wearing wolfskins on their heads. The Wolven Guard was charging in, prisoners and convicts of both Old and New Land, fighting to one day repay their debts to society and earn back their freedom. Melee infantry no longer was the main focus of the army, true, but Wolves of Seron did their job admirably, though it also meant that they were now way ahead of the main force, and while their weapons certainly were impressive, their armor was not, and they soon felt it, as every soldier of Emerald Colonist focused their attention on them. But the wolves, as always, laughed in the face of all odds, and even as their numbers dwindled at an alarming rate, as they were bombarded with magic, arrows and javelins, they kept charging on, tearing through everyone in their way, drawing attention away from the main army who kept bombarding the battlefield with all it had. Tanks rolled forward and spewed flames again, or just rolled over all unfortunates who failed to get out of the way. Cannons fired so often, their barrels became too hot to touch, something used by Frostlings who launched magical, icy projectiles towards them and jammed the machines in right flank for good several minutes, while their crews desperately tried to fight both frost and flame. Automatons clanked forward as well, shooting and stabbing everyone in their way with ruthless efficiency, while General Brimir took his flying company and descended upon the walls to deal with some of the shamans there. But forces of Lady Marshall fought on relentlessly, despite odds turning completely against them. Even goblins who, unlike Cold Ones, had no business fighting to the bitter end, rushed into the fray, and another venomous attack from them completely decimated the Wolven Guard, who by then were reduced to just a dozen people. And that, quite literally Dirty Dozen, decided that they did what they could and ran away, though by the time they got out of range of their goblin pursuers, only 4 of them were still alive, and all of them wounded. But by then, the fight outside of the walls was almost over. The goblins were turned into red mist by artillery and finished off by tanks, and soon First Gate was broken open by automatons. By then, however, only last dregs of local militia were still alive, and though they stood valiantly, they were soon overrun by Brimir and his Wyvern Riders, who quite literally tore the last of the frozen warriors apart. But then, before the slaughter could begin, General Vestrand ordered his men to stand down and addressed terrified inhabitants of the city. He was willing to meet with their leaders and discuss terms of their unconditional surrender. It was, as the general himself said later, an idea he never believed to work, so one could only imagine his surprise when a group of richly dressed, unarmed frostlings suddenly appeared on the streets and approached him with their arms held high in the air.
A toast to all of you, my friends, for it is thanks to your bravery that we can celebrate this victory today. Not a flawless one, unfortunately, but as far as siege assaults go, this one turned out to be a lot better than expected, even though we hardly had to assault anything. Still, that's another victory for us, and a massive, well-fortified town taken from our enemies, so let's drink to that. And in the meantime, Lieutenant, go out there and find out if there are any survivors of the Wolven Guard. I can bet you there's at least a dozen of them who are still kicking. Those lads are way too tough to just roll over and die. Anyway, when you find them, tell them that they have officially been rehabilitated in the eyes of the country for their actions today, and that from now on they're free people and can do whatever they want. And then, tell them that if they want to join any other company and start any actual wages, we'll welcome them with open arms. My bet is they will all jump back into the force once again, some to earn some money and to start new lives, others to just crack heads without consequences. Now go, soldier. And now, finally to you, my dearest hosts. I have to say, I expected a lot more from you. I still remember fighting your armies back on the continent, back when I didn't even have a beard and your leaders always used to lead from the front, or at least were close to the fighting. And yet, here you are, Frosting chieftains hiding behind their walls and surrendering at the very first sign of trouble. How extremely disappointing.
That's because we are not warriors. You have already killed them back in Ermendal. We are just refugees of your previous massacre.
Unfortunately, you're wrong there. I had nothing to do with the assault on your spire in the north. If I took part in it, I would make sure you wouldn't be allowed to escape. But, luckily for you, times have changed, and Mutsakka wants to give you a second chance. Personally, I think it's a mistake, but the man who pays my salary thinks otherwise, and I'm not here to question Minister Gerstein's decisions. So, it is your lucky day. I stand before you with an offer of peace. Surrender to us now, and Mutsakka is willing to take you under its coal-dust-covered wing. Assuming, of course, that you will also provide us with information about yourselves.
Surrender to you? So you could do to us what you've done to our warriors? We know you've sent them to that volcanic island, which is like a torture to them. Do you plan to do the same to us? Just herd us somewhere and watch us wither and die?
We will relocate you, sure, but choosing a location to send you is not within my jurisdiction, so I have no bloody idea. And as for that camp near Dulcemere, I've been told there are some sorcerers there, providing magically powered coolers to your people.
How generous of you. All you do is prolong their suffering, and we will not allow you to do the same thing to our people here. We would rather die than...
Wrong answer, Icicle Girl. Pride is a stupid thing to die for, so let me ask the rest of you once again. Are you willing to surrender? And believe me, I will keep asking until I receive an answer I want to hear.
Swing your blade all you want, dwarf. You are not changing anything. If anything, you are just making things easier for us.
Easier? The hell are you talking about?
You have no idea, don't you? Of course you don't, you warmbloods never once stop to think. Instead you prefer to just solve everything with violence. But in that case, let me enlighten you. Our people are doomed no matter what you do. Our fate was sealed when the spire in Ermendal collapsed, and when our Lord Palhad has fallen. Without him there is no way to create more of us. It was a mighty, complicated spell that allowed the transformation to happen, spell known only to the Archmage and his few apprentices. But our creator and most of his followers were slaughtered by Arius Erigen during the rebellion. Only Lord Palhad survived, thanks to his mastery of illusions that allowed him to hide his true nature to flee back to the Empire. He then learned of us, survivors of the war, and followed us here, but now that he's dead we have no way to replenish our numbers. Ever. All that is left for us is to dwindle and die.
Good. Saves us a lot of work. But I admit I have not expected you to be so dejected about it. Sure, your magicians may be dead, but do you really think that's the end of the line for you? You were people from other races before, so what makes you think you can be restored to your original form somehow?
And who would do this for us? You? Continental sorcerers? Imperial ones? No, they would just attack us as soon as we approached them. Besides, we had our brightest minds working on it ever since Lord Palhad died, and they came up with nothing.
So your plan is to just roll over and die without even trying? This is really a sad sight. Here you are, a menace that terrorize an entire continent, reduced to a bunch of broken cowards. This is not the end I thought you would meet. I always believed you would meet your end in some massive historical battle between hundreds of thousands of soldiers. What a letdown.
Gloat all you want, dwarf, but know that even though we may be broken, we will never accept your offer, because vengeance is all we have left. As long as we draw breath, we will fight you, if only to avenge our fallen and go to the stars with certainty in our hearts.
I see. My employers were afraid you'd say something like this. You see, Mutsakka is more than willing to reach out to you, if you were no longer a threat. But now, after saying all this, I can see that you're not as broken as I thought, which means the offer is no longer standing. We're done here. Captain, Colonel, round these ones up and send them back to Dulcemere. I have no doubt there's a lot of people there who would like to either interrogate or dissect them to learn as much as they could. As for the rest of them, send teams into the city and capture any frosting that looks important and send them north as well. Once you're done with that, send tanks into the street and burn all of the remaining ones out. Wait, no. On the other hand, that city is too good defensive position to just burn it down. In that case, round up all of the survivors, herd them in front of the walls, and meld them there. And, Captain, do send a word to my personal retinue to oversee that particular operation. We don't want any bleeding hearts to allow some of our enemies to escape, not when this war is still far from over. Now get to it.
Yes, General. But if you don't mind me saying, something doesn't add up here. They said they're going to fight you to the end, and yet they're surrendering.
Maybe they meant some of their less cowardly comrades. But you're right, we should watch out for surprises
Sir, urgent report from the city. The place is empty. We found only a handful of civilians there, but they were running towards the mountain, so our soldiers followed them. They found a tunnel where the Frostings fled into, but it was rigged with explosives and collapsed on the team we sent inside. We found at least 3 more of these tunnels, all already collapsed.
So the ones here were merely delaying our advance to buy the people time to escape underground. Looks like they're really not as broken as I thought. But it doesn't matter. We're the army, so we don't have anything to do with their civilians until they start causing trouble. Now then, back to work everyone. You still have your orders. Don't forget we still have a war to win.